Start my recording. All right. So first of all, thank you for joining us today. My name is Mark Phillip, and I'm an application engineer with Studica Incorporated. A little bit about Studica. We're a software and hardware reseller for schools, primarily deal in North America, Canada, and the United States. We've been doing this for over 30 years, so we have quite a lot of experience working with schools and kind of navigating the educational framework of everything. My contact information is here on the slide, markp@studica.com, if you need to get in touch with me for any reason, and our website is www.studica.com. I'm also joined by my colleague Christy Leitner, who's our marketing director, and she's the one who's been sending you reminders and stuff, so she helps me out a lot with these things. So today we're going to be looking at the Babbel language learning software. So this is something that we started offering at Studica, and we're excited to talk about it. And so in this presentation, we're going to look at, we're actually not just going to be talking about Babbel exclusively. We'll also be looking at some statistics related to language learning in the United States and kind of how that's changing over time and how bilingualism is becoming increasingly prevalent. We're going to look a little bit about the economics of being bilingual, and then we'll also jump into some of the language trends that are being used in education currently. So there we go. So this is kind of my roadmap for the presentation. We're going to look at the increasing number of bilingual speakers, some of the language requirements that are being incorporated at higher education institutions. We're going to look at globalization and what that means for the global economy, as well as, you know, why that's important for bilingual speakers and how that's going to give them an edge in the future. And one last thing I like to point out on the slide that I don't really dive into is health and well-being. So bilingualism in general has been studied to death at this point. And overwhelmingly, the consensus is that bilingual speakers generally have a couple of cognitive improvements compared to monolingual people, being things like better attention span, the ability to solve problems quicker, and the ability to adapt to new information faster. So this is an interesting realm. I'm not going to dive too hard into it, but I just want to make a point of it so that we don't get totally hung up on, say, the economics of it or how we're going to teach it, but also like how that can help people in general, maintain their cognition better into older age. So interesting field of research. If that's something interesting to you, I recommend Googling it. A lot of good research in there. So the first thing we're going to look at is the increasing number of the increasing amount of bilingualism, I should say, in the United States. What this chart is from the U.S. Census Bureau, and this was based on 2008 projections of population. And what we're looking at here is the population of people 5 years and older that are speaking a language other than English at home in the United States. We have 3 dates here, 2010, 2015, 2020. And we can basically see over time that we're consistently increasing in the number of people who are speaking a language other than English at home. So the trend here is clearly that we have a huge number of people who are speaking multiple languages, right, on top of English. And this increasing amount of bilingualism is going to help drive more motivation for people to learn to speak other languages so they can better speak with friends, colleagues, family members, etc. And how we provide this sort of learning for people is going to be heavily reliant upon the education sector, right? Like, how well is education prepared to be teaching people multiple different languages? I also want to point out these numbers are in the millions. So when we see 71.8, we're talking 71.8 million people, which is roughly a fifth of the United States population. So on the topic of language requirements, the Modern Language Association, who basically does a bunch of research on multilingualism, bilingualism, and stuff like that, they found that 50% of higher education institutions in the U.S. have some kind of language requirement. This means that basically you have to take some sort of foreign language to get a degree, right? Whether it's an associate's, bachelor's, master's, PhD. Now, the key thing about this is that students going into college can be better prepared for this sort of coursework if they start earlier in K-12. And we know that most of the research shows that people who start earlier with learning a second language learn it much better and actually retain the information better and have other benefits compared to people who learn a second language later in life. A lot of interesting research there. So getting them started sooner than later is actually going to be more beneficial for students going into college. So this graph is kind of showing us an example of that. This is the percent of institutions that have developed some kind of international or global learning outcome, which essentially isn't necessarily exclusive to language, but generally these courses are either language courses or incorporate learning another language. And what we see is that across all the different degree types from 2006 to 2011, there's been an increase of requirements. So even at the associate's degree level, a 2-year degree, 46% of institutions are requiring you to take some kind of foreign language. So yeah, the demand here is increasing. The expectation for college students is increasing that you will be learning or at least taking coursework on another language. So let's talk a bit about the economics of bilingualism here. So we're going to look at globalization and sort of the job prospects for people who are bilingual. Globalization, I'm going to kind of define here loosely as it's the idea of like the global economy, the fact that more and more countries are opening up trade and easing back on barriers and restrictions and allowing often what's called like free trade. So all over the world, more and more businesses and corporations from different countries are all doing business with one another, and this is increasing the demand for bilingual speakers because if a bank is going to be operating in a different country than, say, the United States, they might need to be hiring people who can speak the language in that country as well as navigate the cultural norms of the country. And so people who can speak the language, they're often in higher demand for a lot of these jobs. And what this graph is showing us is the number of online job listings for workers with bilingual skills between 2010 and 2015. And we see over 2 times increase of job listings. I always like to point out that this could also be somewhat related to the increased prevalence of online job sites between 2010 and 15. The fact is, like, by 2015, we had more websites available for finding jobs online. So some of that might be accounted for there. What's interesting, though, is that the demand for these jobs is actually spread pretty, I guess that's kind of evenly across different prestiges. So when we talk about prestige of a job, how that's measured in this statistic is basically like, how do people perceive the prestige of a specific job, right? So most people would consider like a doctor to be a high prestige job, and a lot of people would probably consider like a custodian to be lower prestige, right? So that's kind of what we mean when we're talking about prestige. And what this chart's showing us is between 20 and 15, the change in share of jobs that are targeting bilingual workers. And this is a percentage change between a 5-year period across the different types of prestige. And we see the biggest change in the high prestige. We're seeing a lot of change in the lowest prestige as well as the highest prestige. The point here is that regardless of which prestige you're in, all of them have seen an increase in postings that are looking for people who can speak another language. So this means there's a lot more opportunity, right? Like if you can speak multiple languages, that's automatically going to make you look better on a resume. Over here on the right, we have employers with the largest share of bilingual listings as of 2015, and most of these are Fortune 500 multinational corporations, Bank of America, H&R Block, Humana, etc. What's interesting is a lot of these are banks, insurance carriers, and data carriers. And that makes a lot of sense because a lot of these companies are operating in these emerging economies. Banks are there because people have a need to store a bunch of money, right? As you see these businesses booming in different emerging economies, those businesses have to put their money somewhere. Data carriers are huge for the infrastructure of emerging economies, right? AT&T, T-Mobile, they're going into these countries and providing 4G, 5G networks and things like that. But the point is, as they're operating in these countries, they need more bilingual speakers on their payroll, right? They need more people to be able to go there and speak with other people in the language they understand. So now we've kind of given the motivation for why we want people to be learning, second, third languages, etc. Let's look at like how is this being taught currently. So I'm going to look at kind of 3 different ways language learning is being taught in education. We're going to look at blended learning, language immersion, and distance learning. So language immersion is this idea that when you go into your classroom to learn another language, you're expected to only speak that language. And so for instance, if I'm going to take a Spanish course, I'm trying to learn Spanish, I would go into the class, and when I walk in, I shouldn't be speaking any English. Even if my Spanish isn't good, the point is like to force you into the deep end, right? To make sure that you're communicating in this language you're unfamiliar with, because the more you use it, the better you're going to be with it, right? And you do have a teacher there to maybe help you through something you might be struggling with. But in language immersion, the focus is much more on having a conversation with your classmates and things like that. It's less focused on memorization and more focused on you actually using it in a capacity that seems reasonable and that makes sense for you. So in the United States, we have roughly 448 schools using this approach, and this graph is basically showing us the adoption from 1971 to 2011. You can see from 2006 to 2011, there's been a huge increase. Language immersion is really popular right now, and it's, I know at least in Europe, this is a really big thing that schools, I believe, especially in like Sweden, are heavily using language immersion all over the country. And they have a huge focus in their schools over in Europe on multilingualism. They often expect students to learn more than 2 languages, and this is how they're teaching it. So it is successful, it's an interesting approach, and it's highly favorable right now. So blended learning is, I don't know if I'd call it a language learning approach so much as like just a in general classroom approach. With blended learning, you kind of create this hybrid situation of you have some days where students come to class for instruction and maybe taking tests and stuff like that. And then you have other days where you're just going to have them do their work through the internet, right? So maybe you have a system like Blackboard or Canvas or something like that, and your students can interface with the class that way. But then the other part of the time in the week, they actually go to class for a lesson, right? This is an increasingly popular thing because the days that you don't have to have students on campus actually save schools a lot of money, facility costs and things like that. But beyond that, a lot of students actually express that they feel they learn better in this environment. It works better with their schedules. When they do engage the material, they're engaging it in a time where they feel motivated and like they are feeling mentally aware enough to take the material. So oftentimes they report a lot more positively on these kinds of environments, and they feel that they actually learn the material better, they retain it better, and it works better with their schedules. Now, with distance learning, we're taking blended learning and removing the classroom equation. We're basically doing everything from everything over the internet. So this approach is actually highly popular in colleges currently, especially at like the community college, city college level to teach GE courses. By 2019, at least 50% of classes in college are expected to be online courses. And a huge reason for this is, again, because of the cost and because of the scheduling and the fact that it just fits better with student schedules, saves the school a lot of money, which should drive tuition prices down. And so it's really important at the college level for that. And this has been really effective for numerous different courses. So in the K-12 level, though, we're seeing a slower adoption of distance learning. A lot of schools are not even interested in doing distance learning, but some schools have implemented kind of like Chromebook programs and things like that to encourage students to go home and do some coursework online. My assumption on why it's a slower adoption is probably related to the fact that there's just a lot more rules that K-12 schools have to follow, and it's not so easy for them to just say, yeah, let's do some distance learning program. Plus there's budgetary constraints. K-12 schools rely on public funding and things like that, so there's not as much clearly there's not as much money for them to just throw behind creating this big distance learning infrastructure. But even in the K-12 realm, we are expecting to see an increase over time of schools that are doing this kind of program. So that brings us to Babbel. So Babbel's a language learning platform. It's basically a software application. It's heavily used in education, and it's focused a lot more on building real life conversation skills. It focuses a little less on definition memorization, although there is some of that in there. They do try and make the material like more relevant and not just what I like to call word spaghetti. So it leverages native language to build upon your existing grammar and vocabulary skills. All that really means is you're gonna navigate the program using, say, English, for instance, because I speak English. But when I go to take a lesson in Spanish, they're going to be delivering, Spanish definitions, content for me that is translated into English so I can learn the material. It focuses on all the different skill sets. Those skill sets are listening, reading, speaking, and writing. And there's 8,500 hours of content in 14 different languages. And to kind of just give you a look at what is Babbel, we're going to take a look here. So here I'm on the website, babbel.com, and I'm on my dashboard. And the Babbel site, well, I guess I'll make this point. What's interesting with Babbel is it's not like a program that you install on your computer. It's actually just a website. So we can access the website through Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, whatever. And that means that I can access it on my PC, my laptop. I could get it on my phone. I could access this on a Chromebook because I have a browser. So as long as I have the internet and a browser that can get to this site, I can access my lessons from anywhere, and it syncs the progress with my account. So I'm going to take a look at my courses, and I'm set for Spanish right now, for learning Spanish. And inside of Spanish, we have a couple different kinds of courses. There's new content that gets updated and created. There's beginners courses, courses related to grammar, intermediate level courses that focus on listening and speaking, courses related to countries and traditions, special courses where you do things like idioms and numbers, and then you have words and sentences, things to just try and train your vocabulary more. So I'm going to look at the beginners courses because I'm definitely a beginner at Spanish. And on beginners course 1, we see this little green dot here that indicates this is where I left off last time I was doing stuff. So I'm going to click on this, and they changed their interface a little bit since the last time I looked. Interesting. So they have lesson 1, lesson 2 is where I left off. Like I can see it says do it again, which means I've already done this lesson. And they kind of tell me, here's the stuff you're going to learn in this part. So we can look at the Mucho Gusto section, part 2. And if I hit start, we'll get a good example of my very poor Spanish skills. But what it's going to ask me up front is if I want to do speech recognition or not. Generally, I recommend speech recognition. Learning how to speak and trying to match the accent is like a really big part of being effective at communicating in another language. So Babbel's going to help you with that as long as you turn on speech recognition. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And
Mucho gusto.
What it's doing right now is basically showing me a picture. It tells me the definition and says what I need to say, which is mucho gusto. And my microphone's listening to what I'm saying, and we see it's recording right now, so it's going to tell me I'm wrong because I'm going on and on. But what I'll do is basically repeat what they say, and then it's going to check and see if I get it right.
Mucho gusto.
Mucho gusto.
Hasta pronto.
Hasta pronto.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes. All right, so that was a pretty simple example. It just goes through the different definitions and phrases, and I just have to repeat it back. And the thing about the voice recognition is that it is analyzing like how I'm saying the words. So it does try and make sure you're using the correct accent. Sorry, I couldn't think of the word. Because the people who are delivering the words to you that you're trying to mimic, they are native speakers. They actually have an accurate accent for the language that you're learning. And so you trying to match them is a big part of learning another language. It's actually the hardest part of learning a second language, according to almost all the research. So Babbel will try and help you with that by, like, if I didn't roll my R well enough on Buenas tardes, it would probably knock me for that and tell me to do it again. So now I continue, and it's just telling me to choose the correct translation for what's being shown down here. So it's saying mucho gusto, which I believe is it's a pleasure.
Mucho
Yeah.
gusto.
So now I'm just matching definitions. So this is a bit more of a memorization right here. Hasta pronto will be see you
Hasta
soon.
pronto.
Buenos dias is good morning.
Buenos
And
días.
then buenas tardes, good afternoon, evening.
Buenas tardes.
You also notice that they use kind of multiple ways of reinforcement. So they do images here to try and reinforce the visual aspect of what it is you're learning. Like buenos dias is good morning, so they show me this picture of like a field on a morning as the sun's coming up, right? Hasta pronto, see you soon is like you're shaking hands, saying goodbye to somebody. Mucho gusto, it's a pleasure, is like two people meeting each other, right? So you're getting these reinforcements to try and help you remember these words and what they're associated with. And in here, they're kind of testing my written ability. So for it's a pleasure, that's going to be mucho gusto.
Mucho gusto.
See you soon will be hasta pronto. And on your phone, if you
Hasta
have
pronto.
the Babbel application, it looks just like this. So you can actually use these little blocks down here to fill in the words.
Buenos días.
And they'll also fill in the special characters that you don't have on, say, an American keyboard, for instance, or an English keyboard, I should say.
Buenas tardes.
And so once they do that, I can go to the next, and then they do complete the dialogue. And I particularly like this one because it's asking me to basically fill in these blanks here in the conversation. It's like
Buenos
a text
días,
conversation. And I like this one because it combines a lot of the words I've learned already from previous lessons, but I also like it because it's actually a normal conversation, right? You're not just throwing definitions out there and throwing them into a sentence together. It's actually like two people having a conversation about something. And I find that when things are more relatable
Buenas
like
tardes,
that,
Jorge.
it
Ya
tends
es
to,
mediodía.
at least for me, it helps me remember things better, or it helps the material sink in more, I think.
Sí, ya es tarde. ¿Y usted es?
And what's also interesting is that they're using words
Sí, ya es
that
tarde.
I've
¿Y
not
usted
yet
es?
learned through the program. So, like, ya es tarde is not something I've learned yet, but they're showing it to me and kind of preparing me for what's coming in the future,
Ella es mi
right?
esposa.
So that when I see it later on, I'm not completely new to that specific word.
Hola, yo soy Claudia.
And then
Mucho
I
gusto.
think it's
Yo
almost
soy Jorge.
down here.
Encantada.
Yeah, and then hasta pronto.
Hasta pronto.
And then ciao, goodbye.
Chao.
Yeah, so the conversation goes back and forth, and then it finishes. And then there's some extra things that they end up doing. So they're talking about using O versus A at the end.
Hola Pablo, bienvenido.
And so depending on the language you're learning,
Estoy
this could be
encantada.
different, but Spanish uses that kind of format. So I'm not going to go through the whole lesson for the sake of time, but it kind of keeps going through different things like this, where you're learning not only new vocabulary, but you're learning like sentence structure, you're learning how the grammar is working out, you're learning about speaking and listening and trying to get your accent correct and things like that. So I'm going to show one more thing here is the vocabulary section. And in here, this is basically where you can review everything you've learned. So I've only done like 2 lessons, so I have a limited number of items here, but through all these lessons, these are the words I've learned. So they put them in here with the English translation, with the Spanish version, and I can listen to them.
Hola, él,
Ella, tú,
I can see how many times I've reviewed them, when I last reviewed them, and then I can assign pretty much like how do I feel about this, these specific words, right, and give them a level of knowledge. And then I can say I want to review the items, and I can choose how I want to review them. I can reinforce like my writing or my speaking, or maybe I just want to cram for an upcoming test and I'm just going to try and memorize stuff, right? I can do like flashcards, for instance. So if I choose that, it'll basically be testing my knowledge. What is she in Spanish? I know that's ella.
Ella.
And so that's right, I get it right. You is going to be tú.
Tú.
I is yo.
Yo.
And so you can kind of see how
Ciao.
I can just keep going through this and
Hola.
say, oh yeah, I know this, I don't know that.
Gracias.
And just make sure that my
Él.
understanding of the words
Sí.
are good to go. And when you're done, it tells you like, what did I get correct? What did I get wrong? And so forth. So this is a good way of being able to review everything. And that was just the flashcard portion. Again, you can review the writing and the speaking and listening aspect as well. So that's kind of the broad perspective of Babbel, very surface level, quick demo. Don't want to spend too much time there, but just give you an idea of what it is. So Pathways to Mastery, we kind of just saw that. There's multiple courses of different levels, beginner, intermediate, and there's even courses like grammar, which even native speakers could probably benefit from. Grammar is often something a lot of people struggle with, even if they know a language really well. And so there's a lot of content there for everybody, not just new learners. And then we look at like, why is Babbel effective? Well, interactive dialogues. So kind of like we saw with the back and forth there was with Carlos and Jorge, was that we kind of had relevant content, right? It was like a normal conversation occurring. And that's a good way of reinforcing, when am I going to use this? How should I use this within a context? The lessons are voiced by native speakers, like I talked about, and that's a pretty big deal for making sure that you're hearing the accent properly and doing your best to replicate that accent, because it's a really hard thing to do for non-native speakers of a language. Speech recognition will help make sure, like I said, your pronunciation is good. You have curated review sessions using that vocabulary section that I showed, where basically you can reinforce what you've learned. And each lesson is only about 10 to 15 minutes. And this is an approach that I think Babbel's calling micro-learning, if I remember correctly. And this is something that more and more language learning programs, actually a lot of different programs, are starting to do this now, where because of how busy people are and the fact that we have so much mobile technology that we can do things on the go, the idea is that you only need 10 or 15 minutes at a time to do something. And in fact, with language, a lot of professionals have found that if you only spend about 40 minutes to an hour a day on language lessons, you can become proficient within a pretty quick time frame of using proficient at the language, within a quick time frame. So really, you don't need to spend a lot of time on each lesson in Babbel to get the most out of it. And probably the biggest thing about Babbel, at least in the context of schools, is the portability. It's available anytime, anywhere, across multiple devices. And which kind of brings me here is like, why do educators use Babbel? Well, the big thing is it's easy to use, it's affordable, which is really important, especially for public schools, and it's available all the time. And it's available on pretty much any platform because, like I said, it's just a website. So if you have an internet connection and a device that can connect to that website, you can use the program. So I know a lot of schools have like Chromebook programs, and one of the limitations with Chromebooks is finding programs that run on Chromebooks. Babbel is a program that will work on a Chromebook. You just go to babbel.com in Chrome and you're good to go. Another thing that I don't have on the slide here, but a big deal with Babbel is I mentioned the affordability, and we know that there are free apps out there for learning a language, but there are drawbacks to those apps, namely the in-app advertisements. There's no quality control there. So in a K-12 school, you can't really control what kind of ads are being shown. You don't know if something offensive or explicit is going to come up, which is that's a disaster waiting to happen. Additionally, a lot of those free applications don't have quality control of the content. They often allow users to submit their own content for learning, and so there's really no centralized quality control of like whether that content fits within the context of the other stuff people have been learning. There's no quality control really of like who submitted this content Are they educators? Do they have a degree? Are they even native speakers, right? So there's a lot of variables up in the air there on like, what are you actually learning and is it effective? And probably the big one to me is that a lot of these apps, even though they're free, they often have in-app purchases and schemes to get you to spend money within the app. Namely, a lot of them will do this thing where if you miss like 3 questions, you have to wait an hour until you can do a lesson again. And they do that to try and encourage you to buy 3 more lives so that you can start learning again, right? Until you miss 3 questions again, then you spend more money. I feel like this is a huge barrier for learning because you can't expect students to not miss problems. And if they're getting punished for missing that problem and not being able to try and fix their mistake and learn more immediately afterwards, then what's the point? I don't think that's a good solution for a school, at least, for educators, where, your students are probably going to make mistakes and they shouldn't be kept out of learning because they made those mistakes. And almost all the language apps I've seen that are free implement a scheme like that. So spending a small price for Babbel up front to me makes a lot of sense. So one thing about Babbel too is it is effective for all the current language trends, language immersion, distance learning, blended learning. For blended and distance learning, you have that online component where you need some way of giving, like, say, homework to students or making sure that they're doing something at home. And the good way to do that is with the software. And it's the same with language immersion. You might be immersing your students when they're in the class, but how do you make sure they're going home and still using the language or still learning the language? So giving them coursework to do through Babbel is a good way of doing that. One thing that's being developed that we like to talk about, because a lot of schools need something like this, is the license management system. Babbel's working on a centralized licensing system so that you can basically hand out licenses to people on campus so that they can use the software. A lot of schools use this sort of licensing system to keep track of their licensing and be able to basically hand it out as needed. So this is something that's in the beta stages, but it is available if requested. So if you do get Babbel for your school, you can speak to us about this and we can see about getting you involved with that. The new feature is constantly being developed, and I'm sure Babbel will have it finalized within a reasonable time frame. So with that being said, we do want to give this offer out for people on the webinar to get a free personal copy of Babbel. A free personal copy is effectively a full version of the program, and we're giving it for free. I think it's free for 6 months, if I remember correctly. But if you email marketing@studica.com, put Bab free as your subject line, we need you to include your school name and state name, and then we'll get back to you with instructions on how you can get the 6-month license. So the idea here is that we just want you to be able to use it and see if you like it and see if it's going to work for what you need to do. And we're giving that completely free, full featured version of the program. You'll be able to access any of the lessons, any of the languages, and see how it works. So again, you just email marketing@studica.com, put Bab free in the subject line, tell us your school name, your state name, and we'll get back to you on what you need to do to get that license. So that being said, I'll open it up for questions. I'll leave this slide up for the marketing side of it, for getting the personal copy, but if you have any questions, just use the chat feature. So I'm not going to unmute the mic so I don't get feedback issues, but yeah, so if you have a question, feel free to ask in the chat menu there, and we'll do our best to answer the question. And yeah, so I'll kind of wait and see if I get anything. And one thing while I wait for questions, I'll put this up. You can see what we have to offer for Babbel at our website, Studica.com, and I would just search for Babbel in the search bar, and you should see it show up, and you can see pricing and everything there. We do have a sales department that if you have questions about pricing and things like that, I do recommend you contact them. You can email them, sales@studica.com. Additionally, you can call us. We have an 800 number, 888-561-7521. And we're available Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you have any questions or anything, you can call us or email us and let us know. I'm not getting any questions, so I'll probably just go ahead and close it out. But thank you, everybody, for showing up. And feel free to contact us if you have any additional questions, and hope you all have a good day. Thank you.